Hello, and welcome to the Warfighter Wire, your weekly update on all the news from across the U.S. military. I am your host, and we have a lot to cover today, from historic and controversial rebranding at the very top of the Pentagon to major force movements and groundbreaking technology tests. The big story this week is a seismic shift in policy and symbolism coming directly from the White House. But we're also tracking major contract awards, the first flight of a new robotic wingman from the Air Force, a contentious decision on the future home of U.S. Space Command, and troops on the move from the southern border to the Indo-Pacific. So let's get right into it. Here's the news for the week of August 31st to September 6th, 2025. We begin this week at the very top. In a move that reverberated through the entire military establishment, the Department of Defense has been officially rebranded. On Friday, September 5th, President Donald Trump signed his 200th executive order, a directive authorizing the immediate use of Department of War as a secondary non-statutory title for the Department of Defense. Now, it's important to note that a permanent legal name change would require an act of Congress. However, this executive order empowers the Pentagon and its leadership to adopt the new name in all official correspondence, public communications, and other documents within the executive branch. The order specifically permits Secretary Pete Hegseth to be styled as a Secretary of War, a title both he and the president had already started using in public appearances. The administration is framing this as a necessary cultural and ideological reset. During the signing ceremony, President Trump called the post-World War II change to Department of Defense a politically correct and woke decision that he says coincided with a decline in American military victories. He stated that the name of Department of War sends a powerful signal of victory and a message of strength to the world. This sentiment was echoed by the department's senior leadership. Secretary Hegseth, who was a key proponent of this change, described it as a move to restore the warrior ethos. He outlined a new department philosophy stating, quote, "The War Department is going to fight decisively, not endless conflicts. It's going to fight to win, not to lose. We're going to go on offense, not just defense. Maximum lethality, not tepid legality. Violent effect, not politically correct." Chief Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell reinforced this, calling the change essential because it reflects the department's core mission, winning wars, and adding, "Defense isn't enough. We've got to be ready to strike and dominate our enemies." The implementation of this order was immediate. Within minutes of the announcement, staff at the Pentagon were seen taking down signs bearing the Department of Defense name. The department's main website, defense.gov, was redirected to a new domain, war.gov. And the official social media accounts on X were rebranded as Department of War and Secretary of War. This action reverses a 76-year-old precedent. The original Department of War was established by Congress way back in 1789. After World War II, the National Security Act of 1947 and its 1949 amendments created the Department of Defense, consolidating the military services under a single civilian leader. Historians note this was part of a broader strategic shift to emphasize deterrence and war prevention in the nuclear age. This rebranding is seen as a symbolic capstone of a deliberate campaign to reshape the military's culture. It aligns with recent actions, such as purging senior military leaders whose views were perceived as being at odds with the president, the ban on transgender individuals in the military, and reversing the initiative to rename bases that honored Confederate leaders. It's a clear top-down message that a perceived shift towards social progressivism in the military is being actively reversed in favor of more traditional and overtly aggressive identity. The strategic implications are significant. The name Department of Defense is inherently non-threatening and aligns with the posture of collective security, which is the bedrock of alliances like NATO. Conversely, analysts suggest the title Department of War is overtly aggressive and implies a proactive rather than a reactive doctrine. Adversaries like China and Russia are expected to exploit this change in their information warfare campaigns, framing it as evidence of American belligerence to justify their own military buildups and sow discord among U.S. allies. For those allies, the rebranding may be viewed as apprehension, potentially causing them to question the defensive nature of U.S. commitments. Also this week, a newly named Department of War announced several major contract awards, signaling continued large-scale investment. The most significant awards reflect a focus on replenishing munitions, enhancing global logistics, and investing in next-generation unmanned technologies. We will dig into some of these in the service-specific sections, but the big ones include a massive $9.8 million multi-year contract for the U.S. Army to Lockheed Martin for 1,970 Patriot PAC-3 missile interceptors, The Navy awarded positions to 59 different companies on a 10-year contract vehicle worth up to $20 billion for a worldwide expeditionary logistics and support. And the Navy also awarded contracts to 5 companies, including General Atomics, Boeing, Anduril, and Northrop & Grumman, to begin conceptual design of a new carrier-based unmanned drone Wingmen. Turning now to the Air Force, where the future of air combat took a major leap forward this week. A pivotal milestone was achieved with the first flight of a Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA, prototype. News reports amplified that late August flight of General Atomics built YFQ-42A. The CCA program is the cornerstone of the Air Force's strategy to generate an affordable mass. This concept is to team relatively low-cost autonomous uncrewed aircraft with our manned 5th generation and 6th generation fighters to increase lethality and survivability. This successful first flight is a major step in making that concept an operational reality. At the same time, the Air Force is working to solve one of the biggest challenges for the new concept. At Duke Field, part of Eglin Air Force Base Complex in Florida, the service conducted flight tests of novel alternative navigation software. These tests are aimed at developing a system that can provide accurate position, navigation, and timing data, what's known as PNT, without relying on GPS. The reason this is so critical is that GPS is vulnerable to enemy jamming and spoofing, and our adversaries know that. The entire CCA concept relies on networked team of multiple aircraft operating in close coordination. This coordination is impossible without precise PNT data. For these drone wingmen to be viable on the future battlefield, every single aircraft in the network must be able to navigate even if or when GPS is denied. So these two programs, the CCA drone itself and the alternative navigation tech, are critically interdependent. The success of one is inextricably linked to the success of the other, showing a clear strategy to build a future force that is both more lethal and more resilient. Also this week, on September 2nd, the Air Force conducted its participation in Northern Edge 2025. This is a premier joint training exercise led by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, held across Alaska. It involved over 125 aircraft and 6,500 service members from all branches. This year's exercise emphasized Alaska's role not as just a training area, but as a critical hub for power projection in both the Arctic and the Northern Indo-Pacific. From air to space, where a major politically charged basing decision is set to reshape the command structure for years to come. On September 2nd, President Trump announced that the headquarters of U.S. Space Command will be relocated from its current provisional home at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. This decision reverses a 2023 determination by the Biden administration to keep the headquarters permanently in Colorado Springs. That previous decision was based on assessments from our military leaders who warned that moving the command would jeopardize military readiness. The Trump administration's rationale for the reversal was multifaceted. The president stated that Alabama lawmakers had fought harder for it, and that Huntsville was his original choice. He also introduced a non-military justification, criticizing Colorado's use of a mail-in voting system, which he alleged leads to crooked elections. The announcement was praised by Secretary Hegseth and Alabama's congressional delegation. However, it grew immediate and sharp bipartisan condemnation from Colorado's entire congressional delegation. In a joint statement, they argued that the move sets our Space Force apparatus back years, wastes billions of taxpayer dollars, and hands the advantage to converging threats of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This highly politicized decision injects a significant degree of uncertainty and potential disruption into one of the nation's most critical combatant commands. Uprooting a command headquarters is a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar undertaking that risks the loss of key personnel and institutional knowledge. This instability comes at the very moment that threats in space from competitors like China and Russia are accelerating daily. Regardless of long-term merits of either location, the move itself creates a window of vulnerability for our command that can ill afford it. On the operations side, Space Force ranges support a high tempo of commercial launches for SpaceX Starlink's constellation. On September 2nd, a Falcon 9 rocket launched from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. This was notable for being the flight debut of a new Falcon 9 first-stage booster. On September 3rd, another Falcon 9 launched from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. And 2 more launches were scheduled for today, September 6th, a Starlink mission from Vandenberg and a Cygnus cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station from Cape Canaveral. Finally, in personnel news, the Space Force announced on September 2nd that it will now accept applications for Air Force reservists in space-related career fields who wish to volunteer for part-time service as Guardians. This is a key step in building out the service's total force structure and retaining valuable expertise. Now for the U.S. Army, which was focused on force posture adjustments and landmark acquisitions this week. On September 2nd, the Army announced the upcoming fall deployment for several major units to support the mission at the U.S. southern border. The deploying forces include the 101st Airborne Division Headquarters from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the 10th Combat Aviation Brigade from Fort Drum, New York, the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team from Fort Bliss, Texas, the 101st Airborne Division Artillery, also from Fort Campbell, the 11th Corps Signal Brigade from Fort Cavazos, Texas, and the 130th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade of the North Carolina National Guard. What's significant here is the composition of these units. The inclusion of an Armored Brigade Combat Team and Division Artillery Headquarters and a Corps-level Signal Brigade, assets primarily designed for large-scale combat operation, suggests a significant evolution in the mission's requirement. While past rotations often involved military police and light infantry, these new units bring substantial engineering, command and control, and logistical power. This indicates that the mission may be expanding beyond patrol support towards establishing large staging areas, managing complex logistics, and potentially even large-scale barrier construction projects. On the acquisition front, the Army made one of the most significant announcements of the year. On September 3rd, it awarded Lockheed Martin a multi-year contract worth $9.8 billion for the production of 1,970 Patriot Advanced Capability 3 or PAC-3 missile segment enhancement interceptors. This is the largest contract in the history of Lockheed Martin's Missiles and Fire Control Business Unit. The PAC-3 MSE is the Army's most advanced air and missile defense interceptor, capable of countering ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic threats, and aircraft. This landmark contract is a direct response to the strategic lessons learned from the war in Ukraine, particularly the incredibly high consumption rate of precision-guided munitions on the modern warfare. The explicit goal is to replenish U.S. and allied stockpiles that have been strained by global demand. By using a multi-year procurement authority, the Army provides stable, long-term funding which sends a powerful signal to the defense industrial base. This allows contractors and their suppliers to confidently invest in expanding production and securing materials, ultimately aiming to keep a hot production line for one of the West's most critical air defense assets. The Navy's focus this week was split between high-end exercises in the Pacific and a significant force buildup closer to home in the Caribbean. In the Indo-Pacific, the major multilateral maritime exercise Pacific Vanguard 2025 concluded on September 5th in the Philippine Sea. This exercise brought together forces from US, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, focusing on complex warfighting scenarios like anti-submarine and air warfare. A key event was a live-fire missile exercise involving the destroyer USS Higgins. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the Pentagon confirmed that the deployment of 10 F-35 fighter jets to the region in response to rising tensions with Venezuela. This air power is augmenting a significant naval presence that already includes at least 2 guided missile destroyers, the USS Jason Dunham and USS Gravely. This dual focus on peer-level exercise in the Pacific and crisis response in the Caribbean illustrates the immense strain on the Navy to meet global demands. Deploying these high-end assets to opposite sides of the globe stretches naval resources thin and raises critical questions about the fleet's overall readiness and its capacity to maintain a credible presence in 2 theaters over time. In acquisition news, the Navy took a major step toward building a future carrier air wing. On September 5th, it was confirmed that the Navy has awarded contracts to 5 companies to begin work on its Collaborative Combat Aircraft or CCA program. Similar to the Air Force program, this initiative aims to develop armed, unmanned aircraft to operate from carriers as loyal wingmen to manned fighters. The contracts were split into 2 efforts. General Atomics, Boeing, Anduril Industries, and Northrop Grumman were selected to develop initial airframe designs, and Lockheed Martin was awarded a contract to develop the Common Mission Control System. This program is intended to address a growing capability gap as the Navy's FA-18 fleet ages and the next-generation fighter program faces delays. The Navy is explicitly leveraging the work already done by the Air Force on its own CCA program to accelerate the timeline. The inclusion of non-traditional defense firm like Anduril signals an urgent effort to speed up innovation. The goal is to get credible, affordable, and long-range unmanned capability onto carrier decks as quickly as possible to mitigate the critical vulnerability posed by the limited combat radius of the current air wing. Finally, the Navy also took a major step to bolster its global logistics network, awarding 59 companies positions on a massive contract vehicle called Wexmac Titus, worth up to $20 billion over 10 years. This will provide a rapid way to procure expeditionary logistics and disaster relief support worldwide. The Marine Corps' activities this week perfectly highlighted the two primary missions of the modern Corps: preparing for high-end conflict in the Pacific and serving as the nation's 911 crisis response force. In the Indo-Pacific, the Corps solidified its forward presence. On September 1st, the Japan Ministry of Defense announced the deployment of 6 U.S. Marine MQ-9A Reaper drones to Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa has been extended indefinitely. This transforms a temporary rotation into a permanent stationing, creating a persistent land-based ISR hub on the strategically vital First Island chain. These Marine drones operate from the same base as Air Force's MQ-9s and Navy MQ-4 Tritons, creating a powerful, synergistic, unblinking eye to monitor Chinese military activity. Marine training exercises also showcase their evolving warfighting concepts. For the first time ever in Japan, Marines with the 3rd Marine Division conducted training with the Navy Marine Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, or Nemesis. This system, which pairs a naval strike missile with an unmanned JLTV chassis, is a cornerstone of the Corps' force design concept for controlling maritime terrain from land. At the same time, demonstrating its global response capabilities, the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, embarked on the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, began an amphibious landing exercise in Puerto Rico. This training is taking place against the backdrop of those increased tensions with Venezuela. The simultaneous training in Japan and the Caribbean puts the two missions of the modern Marine Corps on the full display. The Nemesis training in Japan is the future-facing mission preparing for a peer adversary. The amphibious exercise in Puerto Rico represents the traditional role of the MEU as a ship-borne crisis response force. This raises strategic questions about resource allocation and whether the heavy investment in specialized capabilities for the Pacific could affect the Corps readiness for its more general-purpose roles elsewhere. Finally, we'll round out this week's report with the news from U.S. Africa Command and DARPA. The new commander of U.S. Africa Command, Air Force General Dagvin Anderson, conducted his inaugural trip to the continent, visiting Djibouti, Somalia, and Kenya to meet with the U.S. forces and partner nations. The visit was intended to reaffirm U.S. commitment to regional stability. Congruent with this high-level diplomatic engagement, AFRICOM conducted a series of kinetic operations. In coordination with the Somali government, the command carried out airstrikes against ISIS Somalia militants on 3 consecutive days, August 31st, September 1st, and September 2nd. The immediate succession of the commander's diplomatic tour with these strikes demonstrates AFRICOM's deliberate dual-tack strategy, using soft power to build partnerships while also using hard power for immediate threat mitigation. And finally, on September 2nd, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, announced a new partnership with the state of New Mexico to establish the Quantum Frontier Project. This is a strategic effort to cultivate a specific geographic hub for quantum innovation. By partnering with the state's Economic Development Agency and leveraging the expertise at nearby national labs like Sandia and Los Alamos, DARPA is investing in a creation of an entire ecosystem for this revolutionary technology, aiming to ensure the U.S. maintains a decisive edge in a field that promises to transform everything from cryptography to intelligence gathering. And that is all the time we have for this week. A week defined by a historic name change at the Pentagon that signals a major cultural and strategic shift for the entire U.S. military. Thank you for joining us on the Warfighter Wire. Please like and subscribe, and we'll be back with you next week. Thank you.